There are moments in life that make you question whether love alone is enough to hold a family together. Imagine an elderly father lying beside a deserted roadside as cold rain soaks through his clothes, his breathing growing weaker with every passing minute, while car after car disappears into the distance without stopping. His trembling hands clutch at the wet ground, searching for the strength to rise, but his body has already surrendered to exhaustion. Just hours earlier, he had climbed into his son's car, believing they were heading to another doctor's appointment. He had no reason to be afraid. After all, this was the same son he had carried on his shoulders as a little boy, the child he had protected from every hardship life could throw at him. Yet on this lonely stretch of road, surrounded only by silence and fading hope, one heartbreaking truth became impossible to ignore. The person he had loved more than anyone else had driven away and left him there to die. He spent 38 years sacrificing everything for one person, his only son. Every birthday, every school fee, every dream came before his own. But on one cold afternoon, that same son drove away, leaving him to die alone. An empty wheelchair sat abandoned. A faded wedding photograph carried memories of promises that once held a family together. House keys slipped from trembling fingers into the mud. A charity van appeared in the distance while, somewhere else, his son smiled comfortably at a family celebration as though nothing had happened. The world believed the elderly father had simply disappeared. But what nobody knew was that someone else found him first. And before the story ends, one person will beg for forgiveness, but it will already be too late. This is an emotionally inspired family story that reflects the painful reality of elder abandonment, betrayal, sacrifice, and the people who sometimes become family when blood relatives choose to walk away. Stories like this are difficult to hear because they force us to ask uncomfortable questions about loyalty, gratitude, and the promises children make to the parents who dedicate their lives to raising them. Around the world, countless older adults quietly experience neglect, abandonment, financial exploitation, and emotional abuse at the hands of the very people they once protected. Many cases never reach the headlines. Many victims never tell anyone what happened because they fear embarrassing their families or losing the little connection they still have. Others disappear into nursing homes, shelters, hospitals, or charity organizations where complete strangers offer the kindness they could no longer find in their own homes. Today's story draws inspiration from those heartbreaking realities and from documented patterns of elder abuse reported by organizations that work to protect vulnerable seniors. As the story unfolds, you will witness how years of sacrifice can be forgotten when greed begins replacing gratitude, how manipulation slowly changes people, and how one decision can destroy an entire family forever. Before we go any deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stay with us until the very end, because every answer raises another question, and every chapter reveals another piece of a family tragedy that no one believed could happen until it already had. Long before that lonely afternoon on the roadside, there was a man named Robert Mitchell, a quiet American father whose life revolved around one simple purpose: giving his only child every opportunity he never had himself. Robert was never wealthy. He never owned expensive cars or vacation homes. His hands carried the scars of decades spent working construction sites, repairing electrical systems, and accepting overtime whenever extra money was available. His greatest source of pride was not the paycheck he brought home, but the smile on his young son's face each time another dream became possible. When Robert's wife passed away after a long illness, grief threatened to consume him, yet he refused to let his pain become his son's burden. Standing beside her hospital bed during her final days, he made a quiet promise that he repeated to himself countless times afterward. He would make sure their son never felt alone. He would work twice as hard if necessary. He would miss meals, postpone retirement, and sacrifice comfort if it meant giving the boy a brighter future. From that day forward, Robert stopped thinking about what he wanted from life. Every decision became centered around one person. Every paycheck, every hour of overtime, every dream he quietly buried became another investment in the future of the child he believed would one day remember everything his father had done for him. As the years passed, Robert watched his son Ethan Mitchell grow into an intelligent, ambitious young man with enormous potential. Ethan excelled in school, earned scholarships, impressed teachers, and quickly became the pride of the neighborhood. Friends often congratulated Robert for raising such a respectful and hardworking son. They admired the close relationship between father and son, seeing them attend baseball games together, repair old furniture in the garage, celebrate birthdays with homemade cakes, and laugh over simple dinners that never cost much but always felt warm. Robert believed those memories would last forever. Whenever Ethan needed new textbooks, Robert found the money. When college tuition became overwhelming, Robert accepted additional weekend jobs despite worsening back pain. When Ethan dreamed of starting his own business after graduation, Robert quietly withdrew nearly every dollar from his retirement savings without hesitation. People warned him to keep something for himself because old age arrives faster than anyone expects. Robert only smiled and answered with complete confidence that his son would always be there for him one day. Those words would later return to haunt him in ways he could never have imagined. Robert never imagined that the greatest threat to his future would arrive wearing the familiar smile of the child he had spent a lifetime protecting. Looking back, the warning signs did not appear all at once. They arrived quietly, almost politely, hidden inside ordinary conversations that seemed harmless at the time. After Ethan graduated from college, he landed a respectable job with a fast-growing technology company before eventually launching his own consulting business. Success came much faster than anyone expected, and Robert could not have been prouder. Every achievement felt like proof that every extra shift, every unpaid bill, and every sacrifice had been worth it. Friends often told Robert that his son had become the kind of man every father hoped to raise, and Robert believed them with all his heart. When Ethan purchased his first beautiful home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, he insisted that his father be the first person to walk through the front door. Robert stood in the spacious living room with tears filling his eyes, remembering the tiny apartment where they had once shared a single bedroom after his wife's passing. Ethan wrapped an arm around his father's shoulder and thanked him for believing in him when nobody else could see his potential. Those words stayed with Robert for months because they sounded sincere, and he never questioned them. He truly believed that no amount of money or success could ever change the loving little boy he had raised with patience, discipline, and unconditional love. A year later, Ethan married a woman named Amanda, someone who impressed almost everyone the first time they met her. She was intelligent, confident, and knew exactly what to say to make people feel comfortable. Robert welcomed her into the family without hesitation because he wanted his son to build a happy life filled with love and stability. During the first several months after the wedding, Amanda treated Robert with kindness and respect. She invited him for Sunday dinners, remembered his birthday, and even encouraged Ethan to visit him more often. Robert quietly thanked his late wife whenever he thought about how fortunate Ethan seemed to be. But little by little, almost too slowly to notice, the atmosphere inside the family began to change. Conversations became shorter. Invitations arrived less frequently. Phone calls that once lasted half an hour were suddenly over in less than 5 minutes. Whenever Robert suggested stopping by for coffee, Ethan usually explained that work had become overwhelming or that they already had other plans. Robert accepted every explanation because he understood how demanding adulthood could become. He never wanted to feel like a burden. Instead, he convinced himself that this was simply another season of life, and that things would eventually return to the way they had always been. What Robert did not realize was that decisions were already being made without him. Conversations were already taking place behind closed doors, and the future he believed was secure had quietly begun slipping beyond his reach. Weeks turned into months, and Robert continued making excuses for changes that became harder to ignore. Whenever Ethan canceled another visit, Robert reminded himself that successful businesses demanded long hours. Whenever Amanda politely suggested that another weekend would be more convenient, he convinced himself she was only trying to keep their busy household organized. The silence inside Robert's small home grew heavier with each passing evening. The dining table where father and son had once shared long conversations now held only a single plate. Family photographs lining the hallway became quiet reminders of happier years, and Robert often found himself standing in front of them longer than he intended, wondering how time could transform a close family into strangers living only a few miles apart. Yet every time Ethan eventually called, Robert's disappointment disappeared almost instantly. Hearing his son's voice was enough to restore his hope. He never complained about the missed birthdays, the forgotten holidays, or the promises that quietly faded away. Instead, he always asked the same question: "Are you taking care of yourself?" It was the question of a father whose love had never asked for anything in return. Unfortunately, love without boundaries can sometimes become an invitation for people to take far more than they were ever given permission to take. Around the same time, Robert's health began changing in ways he could no longer ignore. Years of physically demanding work had left him with aching joints, recurring back pain, and occasional dizzy spells that appeared without warning. His doctor recommended regular checkups, lighter activity, and more rest, advice that sounded simple but felt difficult for a man who had spent his entire life believing that hard work solved every problem. Ethan suddenly became much more attentive after learning about his father's condition. He began visiting more frequently, insisting on driving Robert to medical appointments and offering to help organize household bills and important paperwork. Robert felt relieved, believing the closeness they once shared was finally returning. Amanda also appeared unusually supportive, bringing prepared meals, offering to help with groceries, and gently reminding Robert that he should think about making life easier before his health declined further. Their concerns seemed genuine, and Robert welcomed it with gratitude instead of suspicion. What he couldn't see was that every conversation about convenience, every discussion about finances, and every suggestion involving legal documents was leading toward a decision that would change the rest of his life. By the time Robert realized that trust had become the most valuable thing he possessed, pieces of it had already been signed away one document at a time, while the people he believed were protecting him quietly moved another step closer to taking everything he had left. One rainy afternoon, Ethan arrived at Robert's house carrying grocery bags, fresh flowers, and the warm smile his father had missed for so long. Robert's face lit up the moment he opened the door. For the first time in months, the silence inside the little house was replaced with laughter that almost sounded like the old days. They shared coffee, looked through family photo albums, and spoke about memories that stretched back to Ethan's childhood. Robert believed those few hours were proof that every difficult season eventually comes to an end. As evening approached, Ethan gently brought up a subject he claimed had been weighing heavily on his mind. He told his father that he worried constantly about him living alone, especially after the recent dizzy spells. He explained that if another emergency happened, nobody might reach him in time. Robert admitted that he had thought about the same possibility more than once. Ethan then suggested organizing a few legal documents that would allow him to help with medical decisions and financial matters if Robert ever became seriously ill. "It's only a precaution," Ethan assured him. "Nothing changes unless something happens to you." Those words sounded responsible rather than alarming, and Robert appreciated having a son willing to shoulder such responsibility. He remembered advice from neighbors who had encouraged him to seek independent legal guidance before signing anything, but he quietly dismissed those thoughts. This was Ethan, the boy he had raised, the child who once cried whenever his father worked late because he missed him so much. Trust came naturally, and Robert never imagined it would become the very thing used against him. Over the following weeks, more paperwork appeared. Ethan always had a reasonable explanation ready. One document would simplify insurance matters. Another would help with hospital admissions if Robert became unconscious. Yet another would make paying utility bills easier while Robert focused on recovering from his health problems. Amanda often sat nearby, speaking softly and reassuring Robert that modern families handle these matters all the time. Whenever he hesitated to read another page, Ethan gently encouraged him not to worry because everything had already been reviewed by professionals. Robert signed each document believing he was making life easier for everyone. He had never been interested in legal language, and his eyesight was no longer what it once had been. What mattered to him was the confidence in his son's voice and the comforting promise that these papers existed only to protect him. Days later, small but noticeable changes began appearing. Ethan insisted on keeping spare house keys in case of emergencies. Certain bank statements stopped arriving at Robert's mailbox. Calls from financial institutions were redirected through Ethan, who always explained that he was simply helping organize everything. Robert thanked him repeatedly, unaware that the control he believed was temporary was becoming permanent. Somewhere beyond his knowledge, signatures, transfers, and approvals were quietly reshaping ownership of nearly everything he had spent a lifetime building. And while Robert slept peacefully believing his family was protecting him, the foundation beneath his entire life was beginning to disappear without making a sound. The first crack appeared in a place Robert never expected. One morning he walked to the mailbox expecting the usual stack of bills, advertisements, and retirement statements, but the box was almost empty. At first he assumed the mail had been delayed, yet the same thing happened again the next week and the week after that. When he called the bank to ask why his monthly statements had stopped arriving, the representative politely informed him that the mailing address had been updated several weeks earlier. Robert frowned in confusion because he had never requested any change. The representative hesitated before explaining that the update had been authorized by the individual listed as his financial representative. That title sounded unfamiliar, and Robert asked for the name attached to the account. When he heard Ethan Mitchell, he forced a small laugh and said, "Oh, my son must have been helping me organize things." He hung up still smiling, but something inside him felt strangely unsettled. For the first time, a quiet question entered his mind. When had Ethan become his financial representative? Robert searched through the folders where he kept important papers, hoping to find a clear explanation, but many documents were missing. Others were photocopies with pages that seemed incomplete. He told himself there had to be a reasonable answer, yet the uneasiness refused to leave. It lingered through the afternoon, followed him into the evening, and stayed with him long after the lights were turned off. The next day, he decided to drive to the bank in person, but before he could leave the house, Ethan called unexpectedly and said, "Dad, you don't need to worry about any of that anymore. I've taken care of everything for you." The words were meant to sound reassuring, but they landed with a weight that Robert could not explain. Everything. What exactly had been taken care of? And why did it suddenly feel as though pieces of his own life were moving without his permission? A few days later, another surprise arrived. Robert received a notice from the county property office addressed not only to him, but also to Ethan. Several months passed before Robert noticed that the life he had always considered secure no longer felt entirely his own. It began with small inconveniences that Ethan quickly explained away. A bank representative apologized that they could no longer discuss certain account details directly with him because another authorized person had been designated to handle financial matters. Robert assumed it was connected to the paperwork he had signed and thanked the employee before expanding Ethan's business. Instead, Ethan spoke gently about Robert's declining health, reminding him of the dizzy spells, the doctor's recommendations, and the risks of living alone. Amanda added that they had found an excellent assisted living community where trained professionals could monitor his health around the clock. Robert listened quietly before shaking his head with a tired smile. He appreciated their concern, but he wasn't ready to leave the house where he had raised his family, celebrated birthdays, mourned his wife's passing, and built a lifetime of memories. Ethan nodded respectfully and dropped the subject, but the warmth that had filled the room earlier disappeared almost instantly. During the drive home, Ethan and Amanda spoke very little, and over the following weeks their visits became noticeably less frequent again. Phone calls grew shorter. Messages often went unanswered for days. Robert blamed himself, wondering whether he had disappointed his son by refusing the suggestion. What he could not know was that his decision had disrupted plans already set in motion, and those plans were about to take a far more devastating turn than anything he could have imagined. As autumn gave way to winter, Robert's health continued to decline, making everyday tasks more difficult than they had ever been before. Walking from the bedroom to the kitchen left him short of breath, and climbing the front steps became a slow, painful effort that reminded him his body was no longer as dependable as it once had been. Even then, he refused to surrender his independence. Every morning, he forced himself to make breakfast, straighten the house, and water the small flower garden his late wife had loved so dearly. Those routines gave him purpose, and as long as he could complete them, he believed he still had control over his life. One evening, after experiencing another dizzy spell that nearly caused him to fall, Robert reluctantly called Ethan. Less than 30 minutes later, his son arrived looking genuinely concerned. Ethan insisted they could not continue pretending everything was fine and urged his father to undergo a complete medical evaluation. Robert finally agreed, grateful that his son had come so quickly. Nearly 2 hours later, Ethan slowed the vehicle near an abandoned service road where only a faded bus shelter and a broken roadside bench stood surrounded by tall weeds. Robert looked around, confused, wondering why they had stopped in such an isolated place. Ethan switched off the engine and remained silent for several moments before turning toward his father with an expression Robert had never seen before. It was not anger or sadness. It was distance, as though he were looking at a stranger instead of the man who had raised him. Ethan quietly explained that he needed to meet someone nearby and asked Robert to wait only a few minutes. Before Robert could ask another question, Ethan helped him out of the vehicle, placed his folded wheelchair beside the road, handed him a small bottle of water that was nearly empty, and promised he would return immediately. Robert thanked him and watched as the car pulled away. 5 minutes passed, then 15, then an hour. The afternoon sky darkened, cold rain began to fall, and every passing vehicle continued without slowing down. Robert struggled to stand, hoping to see Ethan's car returning over the distant hill, but there was nothing except endless silence and the growing realization that the person he had trusted above everyone else was not coming back. As daylight disappeared completely, Robert finally understood the truth he had spent his entire life believing could never happen. His own son had abandoned him, leaving him alone beside an empty road with no way home, no strength to walk, and almost no hope that anyone would ever find him alive. The temperature continued to fall as darkness settled over the deserted roadside, and with every passing hour Robert's strength faded a little more. Rainwater soaked through his jacket until it clung heavily to his frail body, while the cold wind seemed to reach straight through to his bones. He tried to wave at every pair of headlights that appeared in the distance, but most drivers never even noticed him. Those who did slowed only for a moment before continuing on their way, perhaps assuming someone else would stop or believing he was simply waiting for assistance. Robert's voice grew weaker each time he called out, until eventually even speaking became an exhausting effort. Sitting alone beneath the broken shelter, he began replaying memories from decades earlier. He remembered teaching Ethan to ride a bicycle in the neighborhood park, running behind him with one hand gripping the seat until the little boy finally found his balance. He remembered standing proudly in the audience during Ethan's graduation ceremony, cheering louder than anyone else when his son's name was called. He remembered working through severe back pain to pay college tuition because he wanted Ethan to have opportunities he himself had never known. Those memories did not bring anger. They brought confusion. Robert searched desperately for an explanation that would make sense of what had happened. Perhaps Ethan had been involved in an accident. Perhaps he had been forced to leave unexpectedly. Perhaps he was already on his way back. Robert clung to those possibilities because accepting the alternative felt impossible. But as the hours passed and no familiar car appeared on the empty road, hope slowly gave way to a heartbreaking truth that settled heavily upon him. The child for whom he had sacrificed nearly everything had made a choice, and Robert was living with the consequences of that decision. Just before midnight, when exhaustion finally overwhelmed him, faint headlights appeared once again in the distance. At first Robert barely noticed them, believing they would pass like all the others. Instead, the vehicle gradually slowed before coming to a complete stop several yards away. It was not an ambulance, nor a police cruiser. It was a modest charity outreach van returning from delivering meals to vulnerable people in nearby communities. Two volunteers stepped out carrying flashlights and immediately hurried toward the elderly man sitting motionless beneath the shelter. One of them knelt beside Robert and gently asked for his name, but he was so weak that his words could hardly be understood. The volunteers wrapped him in warm blankets, offered him water, and called emergency medical services without wasting another second. As they waited, one volunteer quietly assured Robert that he was safe now and that they would not leave him alone. Those simple words, spoken by complete strangers, brought tears to Robert's eyes because they were the first genuine comfort he had received in what felt like an eternity. While paramedics transported him to the hospital for treatment, the charity workers remained close by, determined to learn who he was and how he had ended up abandoned in such an isolated place. None of them could have imagined that the investigation into Robert's identity would uncover a family secret built on deception, greed, and betrayal, or that the people responsible were already living as though he had vanished forever. Robert regained consciousness nearly 2 days later in a quiet hospital room, surrounded not by family members, but by nurses and volunteers whose faces he had never seen before. The doctors explained that he had arrived suffering from severe dehydration, mild hypothermia, exhaustion, and dangerously low blood pressure. Had the outreach team reached him much later, the outcome might have been very different. Robert listened carefully, but asked only one question. "Has my son been here?" The nurse paused before gently shaking her head. No one had called the hospital asking about him. No missing person report matching his description had reached their department. No family member had visited. Robert closed his eyes, trying to understand how so much time could pass without Ethan searching for him. He refused to believe his son had abandoned him intentionally. Deep inside, he continued defending the very person who had left him on that lonely roadside. He convinced himself there had to be an explanation that simply had not been discovered yet. The charity volunteers visited him every afternoon, bringing fresh clothes, books, and warm meals. One volunteer in particular, a compassionate woman named Grace Holloway, spent hours listening as Robert slowly shared pieces of his life. He spoke proudly about Ethan's childhood, the sacrifices made after his wife's death, and the successful business his son had built from the retirement savings Robert had gladly invested years earlier. Grace noticed something unusual. Every story Robert told celebrated Ethan's accomplishments, yet not once did he complain about his own suffering. Even after everything that had happened, he seemed more worried about his son's well-being than his own. That quiet loyalty deeply moved everyone who met him, making the mystery surrounding his abandonment even more difficult to understand. When doctors finally determined that Robert no longer required hospital care, Grace arranged for him to stay temporarily at the charity home's residential center while they worked to locate his relatives. The home was modest but filled with kindness. Many of the residents had experienced different forms of abandonment, financial hardship, or loneliness, and they welcomed Robert without asking uncomfortable questions. For the first time in many months, he shared meals with people who genuinely cared whether he smiled, slept well, or needed assistance. Yet every evening, before going to bed, Robert sat near the window hoping his son would suddenly appear. Meanwhile, Grace began making discreet inquiries. She contacted local authorities, searched public records, and eventually located information connected to Robert's address. What she discovered left her speechless. According to official property records, Robert Mitchell was no longer listed as the legal owner of the home where he had lived for more than 3 decades. Ownership had been transferred months earlier. Further searches revealed additional financial filings showing significant changes to accounts connected to Robert's estate. Even more disturbing, there was no active missing person report filed by Ethan despite the many days that had passed since Robert disappeared. Grace immediately realized this was no ordinary family misunderstanding. Someone had quietly erased Robert from nearly every part of the life he once owned while making almost no effort to find him. As she closed the file and looked across the room at the gentle old man laughing with other residents, one question refused to leave her mind. If Ethan truly believed his father was missing, why had he remained so remarkably silent? Grace could not ignore what she had uncovered, yet she also understood that accusations without evidence could destroy lives. Instead of confronting anyone immediately, she carefully began gathering every available record connected to Robert's finances, property, and medical history. What started as a simple effort to reunite an elderly father with his family gradually became something far more troubling. The timeline refused to make sense. Several legal documents transferring control of Robert's affairs had been signed only weeks before he disappeared. The signatures appeared genuine, but Grace noticed that many of the transactions happened unusually quickly, almost as though someone had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to put them into effect. She contacted the attorney whose name appeared on one of the filings. While the attorney could not discuss confidential matters, one brief comment stayed with her. He confirmed that all instructions had come through Robert's legally appointed representative rather than Robert himself. Grace thanked him politely, ended the call, and sat in silence. She looked across the common room where Robert was helping another resident complete a jigsaw puzzle, smiling with the same quiet patience that had defined his entire life. It was difficult to reconcile that gentle man with the legal paperwork describing him as someone no longer capable of managing his own affairs. Grace realized she needed answers, not assumptions. More importantly, Robert deserved the truth, even if that truth carried the potential to shatter what little hope he still held on to. Several days later, another discovery raised even more questions. Grace found recent photographs on social media showing Ethan and Amanda hosting an elegant family gathering at their beautifully renovated home. Friends congratulated them on a wonderful new chapter and admired the extensive renovations, expensive furnishings, and celebrations taking place inside the very property Robert had once proudly called home. As Grace examined the smiling faces in those photographs, one detail immediately caught her attention. The celebration had taken place only days after Robert was found barely alive beside the roadside. There was no public appeal asking whether anyone had seen him, no request for information, no message expressing concern that an elderly father had disappeared without explanation. Instead, every photograph projected the image of a family enjoying life as though nothing unusual had happened. Grace showed none of this to Robert. She believed he had endured enough pain already and wanted to protect him until she understood the full picture. Quietly, she contacted an attorney experienced in elder financial exploitation and arranged a confidential meeting. After reviewing the documents and listening carefully to everything Grace had discovered, the attorney leaned back in his chair and spoke words that changed the direction of the entire case. "If these records tell the story I believe they do," he said calmly, "this may not simply be a heartbreaking family dispute. It could involve deliberate abandonment, financial exploitation, and the unlawful transfer of an elderly man's assets. Before anyone is confronted, we need evidence strong enough that the truth cannot be denied." At that moment, Grace understood the hardest part of Robert's journey was not behind him. It was only just beginning. The attorney advised Grace not to contact Ethan immediately. Experience had taught him that people who believed they had covered their tracks often revealed more than investigators could ever uncover simply by giving them time. Instead, he recommended building a complete picture of Robert's life before confronting anyone. Over the following days, Grace sat with Robert for hours, gently encouraging him to talk about the years leading up to his disappearance. Their conversations were never rushed. Sometimes they lasted only a few minutes before Robert became tired, and other times they stretched well into the evening as memories returned one after another. He spoke about the small traditions he and Ethan had shared after his wife passed away, how every Thanksgiving they cooked together, how every Christmas morning Ethan insisted on opening only one present before making breakfast with his father, and how every birthday ended with the same promise. "I'll always be there for you, Dad." Robert smiled whenever he repeated those words because, even now, He wanted to believe they had once been genuine. Grace listened carefully, taking notes only after their conversations ended. One detail continued to trouble her. Robert clearly remembered signing paperwork at Ethan's request, but he had never intended to surrender ownership of his home, his savings, or control over every important decision in his life. He had believed he was simply preparing for emergencies, trusting that his son would protect him if illness ever made that necessary. The difference between what Robert believed he was signing and what the legal records appeared to show could determine whether this was merely a tragic misunderstanding or something far more serious. While Grace focused on Robert's account, the attorney began assembling independent evidence. Public records revealed that ownership of Robert's home had changed hands only weeks before his disappearance, followed almost immediately by a substantial loan secured against the property. Financial statements obtained through proper legal channels suggested that large sums had been withdrawn from accounts Robert had spent decades building through hard work and careful saving. Neighbors also agreed to speak. Several remembered seeing Ethan visit his father frequently during the months before Robert vanished, but one elderly neighbor recalled something that stood out from every other statement. She remembered overhearing raised voices one afternoon when an upstairs window had been left open. Although she could not hear every word, she clearly recalled Robert saying, "I'm not leaving this house. Your mother wanted me to spend the rest of my life here." Moments later, she heard a car door slam before Ethan drove away at high speed. At the time, she dismissed the argument as a private family disagreement, believing they would eventually reconcile, as many families do. Looking back after learning Robert had been found abandoned miles away, that memory no longer seemed ordinary. It became another piece of a growing puzzle, one that suggested the roadside where Robert had nearly lost his life was not the beginning of this tragedy, but the final step in a plan that had unfolded gradually over many months. The deeper the attorney looked, the more difficult it became to dismiss the evidence as a series of unfortunate coincidences. Every document seemed to lead to another question, and every answer exposed another decision that had quietly stripped Robert of the life he believed was still his. Yet the attorney reminded Grace that documents alone rarely revealed a person's intentions. They needed to understand why Ethan had changed so dramatically. Robert continued searching his own memories, hoping to identify the moment everything began to fall apart. Slowly, one conversation returned to him with surprising clarity. It had taken place nearly a year before he was abandoned. Ethan had visited late one evening after work, exhausted and unusually distracted. He admitted that his business had expanded too quickly, that several important contracts had failed, and that creditors were demanding immediate repayment. Robert had offered encouragement without asking for details, reminding his son that every successful person faced setbacks. Ethan hesitated before asking whether his father would consider using the house as collateral for a temporary business loan. Robert loved his son deeply, but the request frightened him. That house represented the last physical connection to his late wife, and the only place where he still felt surrounded by the memories they had built together. He gently refused, promising instead to help in any other way he could. Ethan accepted the answer politely, but as he walked toward the door, Robert noticed disappointment on his face unlike anything he had ever seen before. At the time, he believed his son simply felt discouraged by financial pressure. Now, sitting quietly in the charity home, he wondered whether that conversation had marked the beginning of everything that followed. The realization filled him with sorrow rather than anger because he could not stop asking himself the same painful question. Had his refusal convinced Ethan that his own father had become an obstacle instead of family? While Robert struggled with those memories, the attorney uncovered information that cast Ethan's financial situation in a completely different light. Business records showed that the company everyone believed was thriving had actually been carrying substantial debt for more than 2 years. Several major investments had failed, expensive loans had reached their repayment deadlines, and legal notices from creditors had begun arriving months before Robert disappeared. To friends and business associates, Ethan maintained the appearance of success, continuing to host elegant dinners, drive luxury vehicles, and post smiling family photographs online. Behind that carefully maintained image, however, the pressure to preserve his reputation had become overwhelming. The attorney could not say with certainty that financial desperation explained every decision Ethan had made, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Almost every transfer involving Robert's property and savings occurred during the same period Ethan faced mounting financial obligations. Grace quietly closed the folder and looked across the room, where Robert was teaching another resident how to play a card game. His gentle laughter echoed through the hallway. Completely unaware that the investigation was revealing just how valuable everything he had sacrificed over a lifetime had become to the son he trusted most. The attorney finally looked at Grace and spoke in a calm but serious voice. "We've reached the point where keeping silent may protect the wrong people. It's time to let Ethan know that Robert is alive." Grace and the attorney agreed that their first conversation with Ethan needed to be handled carefully. Their goal was not to accuse him over the phone or give him time to prepare explanations before the facts had been fully examined. Instead, the attorney placed a brief call requesting a meeting concerning Robert's legal affairs, deliberately saying nothing about where Robert was or even whether he had been located. Ethan answered with surprising calmness. He did not sound frightened or relieved. He simply asked whether the matter could wait until the following week because he was busy with business commitments. The attorney politely insisted that the meeting could not be postponed. After a brief silence, Ethan reluctantly agreed to come to the office the next afternoon. When the call ended, everyone in the room exchanged uneasy glances. Grace had expected a son whose missing father had suddenly become the subject of a lawyer's inquiry to react with alarm, to ask whether Robert had been found safe, or at least to demand an explanation. Instead, Ethan never once asked the question every concerned child would normally ask. "Is my father all right?" His complete absence of curiosity settled heavily over the room. The following afternoon, Ethan arrived dressed in an expensive suit, carrying the confidence of a successful businessman. He greeted the attorney with a firm handshake and offered a polite smile, but the moment he noticed Grace sitting quietly beside the conference table, uncertainty briefly crossed his face. He searched the room, perhaps expecting to find documents waiting for his signature or another routine legal discussion. What he did not expect was the attorney calmly placing a recent photograph of Robert on the table. It showed him smiling gently at the charity home, healthier than he had been weeks earlier, but still visibly recovering. Ethan stared at the photograph without speaking. The room remained silent until the attorney finally broke it. "Your father is alive." For several long seconds, Ethan said nothing at all. His expression changed rapidly from surprise to disbelief before settling into careful composure. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and quietly asked where Robert had been found. The attorney answered truthfully, explaining only that volunteers from a charity outreach program had discovered him abandoned beside an isolated roadside suffering from exposure and severe dehydration. Ethan immediately lowered his head into his hands and claimed he had been searching for his father ever since he disappeared. He insisted that Robert had become confused during a medical appointment, wandered away while he briefly stopped for assistance, and could not be found despite frantic efforts. According to Ethan, guilt had haunted him every day since then. The explanation sounded rehearsed, almost too complete, and Grace noticed that he described details nobody had asked about. When the attorney requested copies of the missing person report Ethan claimed to have filed, he hesitated before explaining that he believed local police had handled everything directly. When asked which officers had taken his statement, he struggled to remember names. The attorney made no accusations. He simply thanked Ethan for coming and informed him that additional meetings would be necessary as they continued reviewing Robert's legal affairs. Ethan left the office believing he had successfully controlled the conversation, but as soon as the door closed behind him, the attorney quietly turned toward Grace and spoke the words neither of them wanted to hear. "His story doesn't match the evidence we've collected. And if that's true, this case is about to become much bigger than either of us expected." The attorney wasted no time verifying every detail Ethan had provided during the meeting. What initially appeared to be small inconsistencies quickly developed into serious contradictions. Local police departments confirmed that no missing person report matching Robert's description had been filed by Ethan or anyone acting on his behalf during the period Robert had disappeared. Nearby hospitals had received no inquiries from him either. Surveillance footage obtained from businesses along the route Ethan claimed to have traveled showed his vehicle heading toward the isolated county road where Robert had later been found, but there was no evidence supporting his account that he had stopped at a medical facility or sought emergency assistance. Even more troubling, mobile phone records placed Ethan in another part of the state later that same evening, attending a business dinner with several clients. The timeline left very little room for the explanation he had offered. Grace listened as the attorney carefully laid out each finding across the conference table, arranging documents in chronological order until the picture became impossible to ignore. Robert had not wandered away from a doctor's appointment. Everything suggested he had been taken to that lonely roadside deliberately and left there without any meaningful attempt to ensure his safety. Grace looked down at the photograph of Robert smiling with fellow residents at the charity home and quietly wondered how anyone could abandon a father who had spent his entire life putting his child first. The attorney reminded her that conclusions must still be supported by evidence before any legal action could begin. But privately, he admitted the investigation had reached a turning point from which there would be no easy return. That same evening, Grace finally decided Robert deserved to know that important questions were being asked about the circumstances surrounding his disappearance. She did not overwhelm him with every legal detail or every troubling discovery. Instead, she gently explained that several records did not match what Ethan had recently claimed, and that an attorney was continuing to investigate. Robert sat silently for several moments before lowering his eyes toward the floor. Tears slowly gathered as he struggled to process the possibility that the son he had defended for weeks might not have been telling the truth. Even then, he searched for reasons to protect Ethan. He suggested that financial stress might have affected his judgment or that fear had caused him to make terrible decisions he later regretted. Grace reached across the table and gently reminded Robert that compassion did not require him to ignore what had happened. A person could still love someone deeply while acknowledging the harm they had caused. Those words remained with Robert long after their conversation ended. Late that night, unable to sleep, he walked quietly through the charity home's garden beneath the soft glow of the outdoor lights. For the first time since being rescued, he stopped asking why strangers had shown him kindness and began asking a far more painful question. Had his love for Ethan become so unconditional that it prevented him from seeing the truth until it was almost too late? Before dawn broke over the garden, Robert made a quiet decision that would change everything. If the investigation continued, he would no longer hide behind excuses. He would tell the complete truth, no matter how much it hurt, because silence had already cost him almost everything he had ever loved. Robert's decision to tell the complete truth marked the beginning of the most difficult chapter of his life. For days, he sat with the attorney, answering every question as honestly as his memory allowed. Some details returned immediately, while others surfaced only after long moments of silence. He described the conversations about legal paperwork, the repeated assurances that everything was simply a precaution, and the growing sense that decisions were being made without his knowledge. Then he reached the morning Ethan had driven him away from home. Robert remembered noticing that the route looked unfamiliar. He recalled asking whether they had missed the turn toward the hospital, only for Ethan to smile and say traffic had forced him to take another road. Robert remembered believing him without hesitation because he had never imagined his son could intentionally deceive him. As he spoke, the attorney carefully compared Robert's recollections with the records already collected. The timelines aligned with remarkable consistency. More importantly, Robert's account contained small details that matched evidence no one had previously shared with him, reinforcing that these memories had not been influenced by the investigation itself. When the interview ended, the attorney quietly closed his notebook and assured Robert that his voice finally mattered. For too long, decisions had been made about him instead of with him. That would no longer be the case. While Robert found the courage to confront painful memories, Ethan sensed that events were moving beyond his control. News that an attorney had become involved spread quickly through his business circle, and several associates began asking uncomfortable questions about his father's sudden disappearance. Ethan dismissed every concern with carefully prepared explanations, insisting that Robert had chosen to distance himself from the family because he had become increasingly confused after his health declined. Amanda stood beside him publicly, repeating the same version of events whenever relatives or neighbors expressed sympathy. Yet behind closed doors, the pressure was beginning to strain their relationship. Creditors continued demanding payment. Legal notices arrived almost daily, and the possibility that Robert might publicly contradict their story weighed heavily on both of them. One evening, after another tense discussion about finances, Amanda asked the question Ethan had been avoiding for weeks. What happens if your father tells everyone what really happened? Ethan remained silent, staring through the living room window at the house that had once belonged to Robert. The walls around him suddenly felt less like a symbol of success and more like constant reminders of the choices that had brought him there. For the first time since abandoning his father, he began to realize that even if no court ever found him legally responsible, there was no escape from the truth he carried within himself. The life he had fought so desperately to protect was slowly unraveling, and the knock that eventually came at his front door would force him to face consequences he never believed would catch up with him. The knock came early the following morning. Ethan opened the front door expecting another delivery or perhaps a neighbor, but instead found two investigators accompanied by the attorney representing Robert's interests. They introduced themselves calmly and explained that they were conducting an inquiry into allegations involving the abandonment of a vulnerable adult and the transfer of property connected to Robert's estate. They were careful not to make accusations beyond what the evidence supported, but they requested access to documents relating to Robert's financial affairs, the power of attorney, and several transactions completed during the months leading up to his disappearance. Ethan tried to remain composed, insisting there had been a misunderstanding and that every decision had been made with his father's consent. The investigators listened without interrupting, making careful notes while asking straightforward questions. When they requested copies of communications, appointment records, and documentation supporting Ethan's account of the supposed medical visit, his confidence began to fade. He explained that some records might have been misplaced during a recent office renovation, while others were stored electronically and would take time to retrieve. The investigators thanked him for his cooperation and reminded him that destroying or altering evidence after receiving notice of an investigation could have serious legal consequences. As they walked back toward their vehicle, one investigator quietly observed that people often reveal more through what they cannot produce than through what they willingly provide. Standing alone in the doorway, Ethan watched them disappear down the street, realizing that the carefully constructed version of events he had repeated for weeks was beginning to collapse under the weight of verifiable facts. Back at the charity home, Robert knew nothing about the investigators' visit. His thoughts remained fixed on a much more personal struggle. Every evening, he wondered whether Ethan would appear unexpectedly, not to argue about property or legal documents, but simply to look him in the eyes and explain why everything had happened. Despite the pain he carried, Robert found himself praying for his son rather than against him. Grace often noticed him sitting quietly in the garden with his late wife's wedding photograph resting in his hands, speaking softly as though she were still beside him. He admitted that part of him still hoped the boy he had raised had not disappeared completely beneath years of ambition and poor choices. Grace gently reminded him that forgiveness, if it ever came, did not require pretending the past had never happened. It required honesty first, and honesty was something everyone involved would eventually have to face. Later that evening, the attorney returned with news that several additional witnesses had agreed to provide statements, including employees from businesses near the county road where Robert had been found. One witness remembered seeing Ethan's vehicle parked there far longer than could be explained by a brief stop. Another recalled watching an elderly man sitting alone after the vehicle drove away. None of these accounts answered every question, but together they strengthened the timeline investigators had been assembling for weeks. The attorney looked at Robert with quiet determination before saying, "The truth is finally finding its voice. The next step may be the hardest one of all, because very soon your son will have to decide whether he continues defending a story that no longer matches the evidence, or whether he tells the truth before someone else tells it for him." Days later, Ethan received formal notice that he would be required to attend another meeting, this time with investigators, legal representatives, and independent witnesses whose statements had become central to the inquiry. The confidence he had displayed during the first interview was gone. Sleep had become almost impossible. Every unexpected phone call made his heart race, and every knock at the front door reminded him that the truth was moving closer with each passing day. Amanda urged him to remain calm and repeat the same version of events they had agreed upon from the beginning. "There isn't enough to prove anything," she whispered, more to reassure herself than to convince him. But Ethan no longer seemed certain. As he sat alone in his office the night before the meeting, he found an old cardboard box while searching for financial records. Inside were photographs from another life. There was Robert teaching him to fish at a quiet lake when he was 8 years old. Another showed his father cheering from the front row at his high school graduation despite wearing a heavy back brace after a workplace injury. A third captured the day Ethan received the keys to his first business office, with Robert standing beside him wearing the proudest smile imaginable. Beneath the photographs lay a birthday card Robert had written years earlier. The handwriting was slightly uneven, but every word reflected the same unwavering love that had defined his father's life. "No matter how successful you become, never forget that kindness is the greatest achievement a person can leave behind." Ethan stared at the sentence for several minutes before quietly placing the card back into the box. For the first time since abandoning his father, the weight of what he had done became impossible to silence. It was no longer about property, debt, or reputation. It was about a man who had spent nearly 4 decades placing his son's happiness above his own, only to be left alone on a roadside when he became inconvenient. The realization settled over Ethan like a burden he could no longer carry without breaking. The following morning, the meeting unfolded very differently from the first. Investigators carefully presented the timeline, witness statements, financial records, and inconsistencies that had emerged during weeks of careful examination. They did not raise their voices or attempt to pressure Ethan. Instead, they allowed the evidence to speak for itself. Each document answered another question, and each witness filled another gap until the story Ethan had repeated so often became increasingly difficult to defend. After a long silence, the attorney placed one final photograph on the table. It showed Robert sitting peacefully in the charity home's garden, smiling gently beside residents who had become his new family. "Your father survived," the attorney said quietly. Not because someone related to him refused to give up, but because complete strangers chose compassion. Ethan lowered his head and covered his face with trembling hands. Tears began to fall as years of excuses finally gave way to painful honesty. He admitted that overwhelming financial pressure had clouded his judgment and that fear of losing everything had driven him to make decisions he could never undo. He confessed that he convinced himself Robert would quickly be found by someone passing along the road, a belief investigators noted did not lessen the seriousness of abandoning a vulnerable elderly man in such conditions. Ethan's voice broke as he whispered words he had avoided for months. "I never imagined it would go this far. I kept telling myself I'd come back, but every hour that passed made it harder to face what I'd done." The room fell silent. No one celebrated the confession. There was no sense of victory, only the heavy sadness that settles over lives permanently changed by choices that can never be taken back. Meanwhile, unaware that Ethan had finally admitted the truth, Robert sat quietly beneath the charity home's old oak tree, believing another ordinary afternoon was about to pass. He had no idea that before the sun set, he would come face to face with the son he thought he might never see again. Late that afternoon, Grace gently approached Robert as he sat beneath the old oak tree reading a well-worn novel that another resident had lent him. She quietly explained that someone wished to see him and assured him that he did not have to agree if he was not ready. Robert looked up, noticing an unusual expression on her face, one that carried both concern and hope. Slowly rising from the bench with the aid of his cane, he followed her toward a private meeting room inside the charity home. As the door opened, Robert stopped walking. Standing several feet away was Ethan. His expensive suit had been replaced by simple clothes. His eyes were swollen from lack of sleep, and the confidence that once defined him had completely disappeared. For several moments, neither father nor son spoke. Ethan finally stepped forward before collapsing to his knees. Through tears, he apologized over and over, admitting that fear, pride, and financial desperation had led him to make choices he would regret for the rest of his life. He confessed that every excuse he had repeated over the previous weeks had only deepened his guilt, and that no amount of money could erase the image of his father waiting alone beside that deserted road. Robert listened quietly without interrupting. When Ethan finished speaking, the room fell silent once again. Robert slowly walked toward him and gently placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "I spent my whole life believing that if I loved you enough, you would always remember what truly mattered," he said softly. "I forgive you because carrying hatred would only imprison what's left of my life. But forgiveness doesn't erase what happened, and it doesn't restore the years, the trust, or the peace that was taken from us." Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he realized that the greatest loss was not the investigation, the financial consequences, or the reputation he had destroyed. It was the relationship with the father who had once believed he could do no wrong. Some wounds could heal, but others would remain as permanent reminders of choices that could never be undone. In the months that followed, legal proceedings addressed the financial matters surrounding Robert's property and assets. Some were successfully restored through the proper legal process, while others could never be fully recovered. Yet Robert surprised everyone with the decision that mattered most. He chose not to return to the house where he had spent so many years because, for him, home was no longer defined by walls or possessions. Instead, he remained at the charity home, where strangers had offered compassion without expecting anything in return. Over time, he became a mentor to new residents arriving with stories of loneliness, abandonment, and loss, reminding each of them that their worth was never determined by the way others had treated them. Ethan visited from time to time, never